This week is Rosh Chodesh Elul, and Rosh Chodesh Elul, of course, has many customs. It represents the period where we're preparing for the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, that begin with Rosh Hashanah and culminate with Yom HaKippurim. And there are three customs. There are many more customs, of course, but three main customs that are brought down in the poskim regarding the minhagim, the customs of Chodesh Elul. The Sephardic custom is to say slichas the whole month of Elul, and it appears from the Beis Yosef that, of course, they blew the shofar also, based on the Pirkei of the Rebbe Lezer. The custom of the Bnei Ashkenaz is that you have at least the week of Rosh Hashanah. The week of Rosh Hashanah, that we have slichas, and if Rosh Hashanah comes out at the beginning of the week, so we start the week beforehand. But shofar blowing begins with Rosh Chodesh. With the whole Chodesh Elul, we blow the shofar. And the opinion of the Rambam, of course, does not discuss about blowing the shofar. It's clear from the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim that the Rambam had the Pirkei of the Rebbe Lezer in his possession. That is the foundation for the blowing of the shofar in Elul. And even that, there seems to be a difference of opinion whether the Pirkei of the Rebbe Lezer is recommending to blow shofar only Rosh Chodesh Elul or the whole month of Elul. But the Rambam, in accordance with his general approach, does not usually, there are exceptions, but does not usually discuss minhagim, customs, or midas chassidus. So, but the Rambam does mention that slichos are to be said during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, apparently. And this seems to have been the practice of the Gonim also, that they would say slichos only during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. And I'm trying to understand, I want to understand all three opinions. Now, my father's Zatzal and my uncle's Zatzal mentions the same story, how my grandfather was standing with the Baal Tokeya on Rosh Hashanah, the person who would blow the shofar, and he noticed the person was a very religious, very pious person, according to the way my uncle gave it over, at least the way it's recorded in the notes on the Shiurim, was that it was in Chaslavich, a very devout Lubavitcher Chassid. And when he came, was about to blow the shofar, and he was saying to Laman Atzeyach and the brachos, or shortly before that, he was overcome with so much trepidation and fear and crying. And my grandfather Zatzal was concerned that as a result of his crying, as a result of his emotional feelings and his emotional outburst, that would interfere with the performance. Well, I shouldn't say performance, a bad word, even though today, unfortunately, that's what it is. With the blowing of the shofar, and he tried. He said to the person, some say that his name was Rabbi. He says, "Why are you crying?" And the person said, "Because of shofar, the mitzvah of shofar." And especially if Lubavitch, I think the Rashab, suggests that the shofar is really the cry of the soul of the human being, wanting to join its source. In other words, I assume that Rosh Hashanah, the first of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, Dirshu es Hashem b'himatzo, search out for God when it's easy to find him, where you can see him spiritually, not chas v'shalom physically. And Aseret Shemei Tshuva, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is accessible. He is near us. And the cry of the shofar in Lubavitch Chassidus, I think, is the cry of the soul wanting to return to its source, because the soul, the neshama of the man, is the chelik elokai mimal. It's the godliness from God. And the Baal Tukeya, because of the awe and this perspective of Tia Shofar, was overcome emotionally, and tears were pouring from his eyes, and he was crying with his mouth, not the tears and the crying that we sometimes fake during the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, but real, sincere tears and crying. And my grandfather said to him, "Do you cry like this before you eat matzah on Pesach?" And the person said, "No. When I eat, I'm ready to eat matzah on Pesach. It's with a sense of joy in the performance of the mitzvah of matzah." And my grandfather said to him, "You should have the same attitude when it comes to shofar as well." And the person, it's interesting, that is just as a side point, and I don't know whether my grandfather had reference to that, but the Tshuvas Harashba, in explaining why we make a bracha of Shehecheyanu over shofar, he says, because shofar is a davar shel simcha, it is an act of joy, because we know that through the shofar, as a result of the shofar, we are going to obtain kapara. But the popular conception of the mitzvah of shofar is one of fear. And the Baal Tukei apparently was a bit of a lamdan. And he said to my grandfather, but the Rambam himself, when he discusses the mitzvah of Shofar in Hilchos Tshuva, he says, even though the mitzvah of Shofar is Exeres HaKosav, it's a decree from heaven, but Remez Yesh B'Davar, there is a hint, an indication, a perspective that is given over with the Shofar. Uru Yeshenim Mitir Maschem, awaken you who sleep, who are engaged in a lethargy, who are not aware of what's taking place spiritually, and prefer to remain spiritually asleep. Awaken from your lethargy. So even though the mitzvah of Shofar is a mitzvah, like the mitzvah of matzah, like the mitzvah of sukkah, but nevertheless, there is a special remez yesh b'davar. There is a message hidden in it. And my grandfather said to the Baal Tukei that the Rambam that talks about the message of Shofar is not in Hilchos Shofar. He doesn't discuss it when he discusses the laws of Shofar, but he discusses it in Hilchos Tshuva. What's the idea? The idea, I think, is based, what I believe, I'm not going to go into it length now, but I've mentioned it before. The perspective of the Rambam in Tamei HaMitzvos is not to focus on the reasons for the mitzvahs when we do the mitzvah, but to focus on the reasons for the mitzvahs when we study the mitzvahs. That's why sometimes when the Rambam gives Tamei HaMitzvos, when he gives reasons for the mitzvah, he gives reasons not in the way the halacha decrees that we should perform the mitzvah, but he gives reasons for the mitzvahs even the way the Torah is presented in the Torah Shebechsav, even though the Torah Sheba'al Peh tells us to do it somewhat differently. Let's say, as I mentioned last week, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. And the Rambam says a person who puts out someone else's eye deserves to have his eye put out. But he says, I know that Chazal, our sages, say that it means mammon. It doesn't mean literally chas v'shalom. Says the tachlis, the purpose of this work of the Moreh Nevuchim is to explain the Torah Shebechsav. How could we explain the Torah Shebechsav against the way the Torah Sheba'al Peh? But the answer is there is a message contained in the Torah Shebechsav also. Not when we practice, when we do the mitzvah, we have to do it in accordance with the Torah Sheba'al Peh. But there is a hashkafa, there is an insight, there is a message, there is an attitude. The Torah Shebechsav, in the way the mitzvah is presented in the Torah Shebechsav as well. And the Torah is telling us that the person who puts someone's eye out deserves to have his eye taken out. But the Torah Sheba'al Peh said had rachmanos on it. And it's mammon. And one who doesn't believe what the Torah Shemal Peh says is an apikoros. But nevertheless, there's a message of the Torah Shemal to make us realize that we are not careful in dealing with others and what we deserve to have, except that the Torah, the halacha, had rachmanas on us. So when we study the mitzvah of shofar, there is a message there. My grandfather, I think this is what my grandfather meant. But when we practice shofar, when we hear the shofar, when we make the bracha of lishmoa kol shofar, asher kirishanu b'mitzvah, we are submitting to the mitzvah. And my father, in line with that, suggested that perhaps that's the reason for the custom of blowing the shofar, or one of the reasons, I should say, of blowing the shofar during Elul. Because on Rosh Hashanah, when we blow the shofar, it's that we're doing it as an act of submission because it's a mitzvah, because it's a command of God. But we focus on the reason for shofar, it's preparation for the mitzvah of shofar. To understand the idea of Uri Yeshenim B'Kir Maskam, awaken from your spiritual lethargy. So that's how my father explained it. Now, I want to explain it somewhat different. The mitzvah of shofar, it's actually based on the way most of the Mefarshim explain it. And in truth, it can work together with what my father's Hatzal said. All the Mefarshim, the Torah, cites the Pirkei of Rabbi Eliezer. The Pirkei of Rabbi Eliezer says that when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai, it was 40 days before Yom Kippur. And of course, there is some cheshbon how it was 40 days. And there was this fear that the Jewish people would make repeat the same blunder they made the first time Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai, when they built a golden calf, and they stood in front of the golden calf and said, Elul Elohecha Yisrael, this is your God, O Israel. And because of this, they blew the shofar. There seems to be two texts in the Pirkei of the Rabbi Eliezer, whether they blew the shofar only on the first day that he went up, or they blew it through every day in the month of Elul. But somehow the blowing of the shofar was to serve as a deterrent from the Jewish people committing the same blunder again. Now we have to understand, how would the blowing of the shofar prevent the Jewish people from repeating the same mistake? There is a message contained in that. But in order to understand that, we have to understand the nature of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of Tshuva. The Yom Kippurim, Yom Ketzu Mechila, it is the ultimate day of Kapara, of atonement, the last day of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva. We know how it manifests itself as a day of atonement, as a day of Tshuva. We say Vidui time and time again. We cry to God. We say Al Chaycha Tunnel of Fenecha. We say Slach Lanu, Mechal Lanu, Kaper Lanu. We beg for forgiveness. But the question is, and I've mentioned this in the past, how is Rosh Hashanah, the first of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, manifest itself as a day of Tshuva, of Kapara, as a day of Tshuva, the first of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva? We don't say vidui. The Ari, according to the custom of the Ari, there's a short vidui. But for the most part, most of Klal Yisrael, even those who are committed to Torah and mitzvos, even those that understand what Rosh Hashanah is, they don't say vidui. So how does it manifest itself? And Yom Kippurim we fast. According to most Shitos, there is a machlokas. Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, not only there is no requirement to fast, we are not even allowed to fast, according to many Shitos. The Beis Halevi would fast in Rosh Hashanah. But it's certainly not the general custom. There's even a machlokes whether to fast Erev Rosh Hashanah. Today, not so many fast Erev Rosh Hashanah, but at one time, fasting Erev Rosh Hashanah was a widely observed custom. But there are shittas that say that even Erev Rosh Hashanah one is not allowed to fast. And then, according to the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, one is not allowed to shed tears. One is not allowed to cry on Rosh Hashanah. Obviously, the Baal Tukeya, especially if he was a Lubavitcher Chassid, he followed the sheet of the Ari, the opinion and the practice of the Ari, who said that if you shed tears on Rosh Hashanah, so there's almost an assurance that the year will be a good year. But Rosh Hashanah hardly manifests itself as a day of tshuva. Nevertheless, it's the first of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva. How we to understand it. But in what way is Rosh Hashanah unique from a halachic perspective? In one way, in the mitzvah of Shofar. So, how does that turn Rosh Hashanah into a day of tshuva, a day of kapara, especially according to the sheet of the Rashba? Okay, the Rashba says that we have sort of like a haftacha, commitment from God, that if we listen to the shofar, we feel that we are going to be that we are going to be forgiven. But how does that work? And I always mention that in the Haggadah and Pesach, in the Dayenus, we say, Ilu kirbanu lefnei har Sinai. V'lo nasan lanu es Torah Dayenu. If God brought us close at Mount Sinai and did not give us the Torah, that in itself would have been very great. That would have been very significant. But how much more so do we have to feel a debt, to give thanks to God, that in addition to bringing us close at Mount Sinai, He gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai as well. What would have been the significance of coming close to Mount Sinai and not receiving the Torah there? Would be like the tourists who go to take a look at the mountain that they assume was Har Sinai. There is among archaeologists and historians, there is an argument which mountain is really Har Sinai, whether it's in what's called the Sinai Desert or it's in Saudi Arabia. And for all we know, it might be a third mountain. But I always mention, my father used to talk about, in addition to the Torah of Sinai, in addition to the commandments of Sinai, the voice of Sinai, as he would call it, there was the fire of Sinai. And I remember hearing my uncle speak about the kolos uvrakim of Sinai, in addition to the Torah of Sinai. My uncle, when he was at the hesped of my grandmother, Aleha Shalom, when he's talking, he talked about how for my grandfather, he received the Torah of Sinai. And for my grandmother, it was the kolos uvrachim of Sinai. Now, to be honest, my grandmother was a very quiet person. But what does it mean? It means the experience of Har Sinai. But they really did not discuss at length. What does it mean, the experience of Sinai? Okay, the kolos uvrachim, the fire of Sinai. Those are words. I would suggest the experience of Sinai manifests itself mainly in sensing the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a manner that never happened before and probably will never happen again. And how did God reveal himself? Or in popular terms, revelation. How did God reveal himself to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai? Uvekol shofar hafata. With the sound of the shofar, you made your presence known. And we could suggest that when my father said, the fire of Sinai, to a sense, it was on a major scale, which was on a smaller scale when Moshe Rabbeinu stood at the burning bush, at the Sneh Boer Be'esh, and the Sneh Neneukol. But here, all the Jews sense the fire of Sinai. The initial meeting that they had with God. It's true, they sensed the presence of God at Kriyas Yamsuf also. But here it was a meeting that gave the feelings of an ongoing, permanent relationship. So, the ongoing, permanent relationship. So, because of that, the ongoing permanent relationship. Rosh Hashanah, when we blow the shofar, the blowing of the shofar is sensing the presence of God. In other words, a Jew who sinned not only went against the commandment of God, in a sense negated Sinai. And he negated not just the word of Sinai, the commandment of Sinai, the mitzvos of Sinai, and the Torah of Sinai, but to a large degree, he negated the experience, the sensing of the presence of God. A Jew who senses the presence of God has trouble sinning. Vidui, we say, Ana Hashem, please God. Chatasi, avisi, pashati lifanecha. Vasisi kach v'kach. Please God, I sinned before you and I did such and such. And I regret it and I'm ashamed. And I'm not going to return to it again. That's the nusach, the general nusach of vidui. It's not the vidui Yom Kippurim. And why do we have to say lefanecha? I sinned before you. Because how did the Jew come to sin? He sees the presence of God. He perhaps understood at Sinai the need to perpetuate the Torah of Sinai. But when Moshe Rabbeinu disappeared from the scene, they no longer were perpetuating the experience of Sinai. It was only in the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu that the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was being perpetuated. And when we do not perpetuate the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we do not perpetuate the Sinai experience, then we're bound to fail. We could even build a golden calf. Now, so in a sense, we equate our situation, we who sin throughout the year, equate our situation with the Jews at Mount Sinai, who also sinned. And in a sense, we have to realize what was their mistake, because their mistake is our mistake. And we have to realize that we have to perpetuate not only the Torah of Sinai, but the experience of Sinai also. of sensing the presence of God, of the Vikol Shofar Hafata, of God making his presence known through the heavenly shofar, the sound of the heavenly shofar. So, because of that, they blew the shofar at Mount Sinai when Moshe went up for the third time to receive the second luchos. To make the Jewish people understand that we have a responsibility to help perpetuate the experience of God's presence. And I think that with this understanding, we could understand the different opinions about slichos and the shofar. Now, what is slichos? The main focus of the slichos is Hashem kel rachum v'chanun erech hapayim. When Moshe Rabbeinu said to God, Hareini chvodecha, show me your presence. And God passed over Moshe Rabbeinu. Vayavor Hashem al panav vayikra. Hashem kel rachum v'chanun erech hapayim. And Chazal tell us, Rabbi Yochanan says, that this is what you should do whenever we're in trouble. And when we focus on our record, when we look at the year and the years past, and we're approaching Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim, the Yemei Hadin, the days of judgment, when everything is being held in balance, we realize that we are in trouble. And we're obligated to say, Hashem kel rachum v'chanun erech hapayim, God, God of mercy. Call out the traits of God, recognizing the mercifulness of God. But it has to be done as a reaction to the sensing of should be done on days dedicated to sensing the presence of God. And what was the problem? Moshe Rabbeinu disappeared from the scene. And the Jewish people were only able to sense the presence of God. Well, wasn't able. They only sensed the presence of God when Moshe Rabbeinu was there. But when the situation changed, when Moshe Rabbeinu was gone from 40 days, they no longer sensed the presence of God. So the calling out of Hashem kel rachum v'chanun is done as a reaction to the sensing of the presence of God. Vayavor Hashem al panav. And when we say it, it has to be Vayavor Hashem al panav also. It has to be days dedicated to sensing the presence of God. And the blowing of the shofar. The blowing of the shofar, even though we say the slichas early in the morning, but the blowing of the shofar, in a sense, reminds us that these are days dedicated to sensing the presence of God. And it's interesting, the Ramah mentions a custom. The Torah says that was the Minog Ashkenaz, the Ashkenaz custom to blow the shofar to blow the shofar morning and evening. And when do we blow the shofar? We blow the shofar after Shacharis and after Ma'ariv. Well, that was the custom in those days. It's not our custom today. During Elul. Now, why? What's the significance? I assume that in those days, like today, they daven Mincha and Ma'ariv together. Now, it's very interesting. Medina the Gemara, from the halach of the Gemara, shofar is to be blown. 60 kolos, 60 sounds of the shofar. And the Gemara says we understand the reason for 30 kolos. I don't want to go into the whole sugya. But why 60? Our custom today is to blow 100 sounds. But halachically, only 60 sounds are necessary. So the Gemara says that we need 30 kolos, the mu'mad, and 30 kolos the miyushav. 30 sounds of standing and 30 sounds of sitting. Now it happens to be that we stand for all the kolos. But the way most of the Farshim understand, the 30 kolos of standing, of sitting, that's the first 30 kolos. The second set of 30 kolos is the Chazaras Hashatz, when the Chazan is repeating the Shemona Esrei. So we have 60 kolos, 60 signs. La'arvei v'sasatan, to confuse Satan. Because in theory, there should only be 30. What does it mean, la'arvei v'sasatan? To confuse the Yetzer Hara. Satan. Who is Satan? So the simple understanding is that the Satan will think after the first 30 kolos, that's it. And he won't try to downplay the next 30 kolos, the next 30 signs. Obviously, the more simple understanding is a Satan who Yetzer Hara. Satan represents the evil inclinations in man. And somehow, the fact that we have 60 kolos negates the Yetzer Hara in man. I would think, in other words, we say the mitzvah is lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the sound of the shofar. When we do it in Chazaras Hashatz, we're talking to God. And we're sounding the shofar so a person could think the mitzvah of shofar is only for God to hear the shofar. We blow the shofar to God, and it's true. The Medrash says, God says, when I hear the shofar, I will give you kapara. I will give you atonement. But we have to listen to the message that we are giving God. It's not enough for God to hear the message. We also have to hear the message. So to emphasize that point, there are 30 kolos, 30 sounds that are not said as part of the Shemona Esrei, that are not said as part of the Chazaras Hashatz. The Rambam's opinion is that during Chazaras Hashatz, everybody has to stand. That's not the general practice today. But we do 30 kolos where a person technically is allowed to sit. We don't. Why? To emphasize to us, to negate our Yetzer Hara, to realize that it's not only important that God hear the message of the shofar, but that we hear the message of the shofar as well. However, there are those who say, about more, that the first 30 kolos that we do, that was a later custom. That was post-Talmudic. The first 30 sounds was something that was instituted for the people who are not going to be able to stay in shul the whole time. So at least they should hear the 30 sounds of the shofar before they have to run back home or wherever it might be. But when the Gemara talks about 60 sounds of the shofar, the kolos of Yushav, the kolos of sitting, that has reference to the sounds that are made when the Chazaras Hashatz takes place. When the Shmoneh Esrei is being repeated, the Baal HaMor's opinion is that except for the Chazan, everybody sits for the Chazaras Hashatz, for the repeat of the Shmoneh Esrei by the Chazan. And the Kolos de Ma'uma, the last 30, is when you get up to leave the shul. So the Chachamim instituted that you have to do 30 kolos, 30 sounds of the shofar before you leave the shul, Rosh Hashanah. What's the idea? The idea is, it's one thing to sense the presence of God when you're in shul. It's another thing to sense the presence of God outside of shul. I mentioned, why was the Beis HaMikdash destroyed? It's not that the Jewish people didn't want a relationship with God, but they wanted a limited relationship. They would go to the Beis HaMikdash to sense the presence of God, and then they would leave him in the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash became God's prison. In a sense, God broke free from the prison. He allowed the walls of the Beis HaMikdash to be destroyed. And so the idea of shofar is to emphasize this sensing the presence of God is not just when you're in shul. And it's interesting that the Slichas, the Rambam emphasizes that you get up early in the morning, actually get up at night. You get up at night yet. We could suggest that the reason for getting up at night is, the reason we get up at night is because of the reason of the Rambam, Uri Yeshenim Mitir Maschem. People have to know how to get up, especially for the presence of God. The people that would like to remain in a lethargy, they don't get up to be in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Medrash says, it's brought down in the Zohar also, that when the Jewish people came to Har Sinai, God made a very pleasant night. They were able to sleep, but God came in the morning and to give them the Torah. And the Jewish people were all asleep. God had taken the mosquitoes out of the air. He gave a nice wind that made sleeping somewhat pleasurable. So people wanted to stay asleep. Not an uncommon phenomenon today when we try to organize a minyan. So because of that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Lama basi veinish karasi veinona. Why did I come? And there was no person there. What does Ish mean? Ish means a person who's significant, who's important. You're not important when you stay in bed. You're not important when you remain asleep. You get significance when you are in control of yourself. Saloma basi veinish, karasi veinona. and the Jewish people had to be woken up. And perhaps that's the reason God perhaps announced his presence with a shofar to remind people that you have to wake up to sense the presence of God. You don't sense the presence of God when you're asleep. And I think that, but the Rambam says that Slichos, the Beis HaKnesses, why does he emphasize here that it has to be in the Beis HaKnesses? Sure, that's where the minyan is. It's in the Beis HaKnesses, in the shul. But the Rambam emphasizes to get up to go to the Beis HaKnesses, to get up to Uri Yeshenim and Tirmaschem. What? But to go to the Beis HaKnesses when the Rambam talks about Slichas during Yaser Shemei Tshuva. But the Rambam's Lishitaso, because the Rambam's opinion is that Dushas Beis HaKnesses, the sanctity of the Beis HaKnesses is a biblical sanctity. And what is the biblical sanctity of Beis HaKnesses? It's the same sanctity as the Beis HaMikdash. In miniature form, of course. What is the sanctity of the Beis HaMikdash? The presence of God. So when we go to the Beis HaKnesses, we sense the presence of God. But it's not enough to sense the presence of God in the Beis HaKnesses. We have to continue sensing the presence of God the whole day. So there's a kol shofar when we leave Shacharis. We're going to work. We're going to the fields. We're going to the office. We're going home. And Ma'ariv, when we leave by Ma'ariv, also, we have to perpetuate that experience. Just like some say, Rosh Hashanah. And the Yerushalmi says, I know the Ari explains it a little different, but the Yerushalmi says that one is not allowed to sleep. There's a custom. If somebody sleeps Rosh Hashanah during the day, and I'm not talking about people who have trouble, that need to take a rest, that if you sleep Rosh Hashanah during the day, Mazal, your mazel is asleep all year round, Yerushalmi says. We have to be awake. The message of the shofar is one of sensing God's presence the whole day of Rosh Hashanah. When we eat the meal of Rosh Hashanah, we have to sense God's presence. We have to recognize in God as King. We have that rest of the whole day of Rosh Hashanah is sensing God's presence. So I think the idea, the Sephardic custom seems to be, they said, Slichos, Hashem kel rachum b'chanon. They would go to shul, as the Ram said, the Ram did it only Aser Shemei Tshuva. They sensed the presence of God. They took an action to sense the presence of God. But the whole day, we have to sense the presence of God. As a matter of fact, the custom is that the person who says the slichas davens all the tefillas of the day. Because there is a relationship. The Shem Hashem Kel Rachum, to emphasize the point that, of course, every tefillah we have to sense the presence of God. But here it's a halacha of sensing the presence of God throughout the day. In the tefillas, in the business, in the house, in the street. They used to say in Elul that even Europe, they used to say the fish in the brooks shiver in Elul. That means the Jews that were passing over a bridge and looking at the brooks, they were shaking in Elul. So it appeared to them that the fish, even the fish, were shaking in Elul. So that's the reason In other words, sensing the presence of God and the Shem Hashem Kel Racham B'Chanan have to come together. However, the minhag of Bnei Ashkenaz is not that way. The Bnei Ashkenaz minhag is that only on the last day, last week, and sometimes the week before, because Rosh Hashanah comes in the earlier part, not this year. Rosh Hashanah this year, of course, is Shabbos and Sunday. So the sensing of the presence of God. So it's the week before. What's the idea? It's the week of Rosh Hashanah. What's the idea? Now I've mentioned the Psik to the Rav Kahana. The Psik to the Rav Kahana talks about the Shiva Nechemta, the 7 Haftorahs between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. And the first Haftorah is Nachmu Nachmu Ami. God says to the prophets, the way the Pir to the Rabbi, the Psik to the Rav Kahana says, go console my people. And then the next week we say, Vatomat Zion Azavani Hashem. The Jewish people, according to the Psik to the Rav Kahana says, God has forsaken me. God doesn't want to have a relationship with me. He sends others to have a relationship with me. God doesn't want me to be close to him, and he doesn't want to be close to me. And then the Navi, the prophets go back to God and they say, Ani Yasora Lo Nuchama. The Jewish people are not consoled, afflicted and storm-tossed, are not consoled. They reject it. They don't believe that you want a relationship with them. They don't see a purpose of tshuva. So then the following week, which is this week, is Anochi Anochi Hu Menachemchem. God says, no, it's me, that wants to have a real personal relationship with you. And God encouraging the Jewish people continues that way next week. Kumi Ori Kivorech. Arise, shine, for your light has arrived, and the glory of Hashem has shined upon you. It talks about the closeness of God. And then there is the week before that is Rani Akarlo Yolo the Pitzli Rina Vitzali Lochala Ki Rabbanei Shemema, sing out, O barren one. Again, it talks about God's involvement with the Jewish people. And then the final week, the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah, So Sosis B'Hashem, Togel Nafshi. So in other words, the first 6 weeks, the Haftorah. The first 6 weeks, the Haftorah basically is talking about the God making known to the Jewish people that he wants a personal relationship. I think the Ramah Shita, the minhag of Bnei Ashkenaz, is that when we say slichas before Rosh Hashanah, it's not just where there is an encounter with God, but an encounter with God, that there is a personal relationship, an ongoing relationship. When the Jewish people realize Anochi Anochi Hu Menachemchem, and that continues, it's not just a momentary thing. It can't be just the Slichas Hashem Hashem Kel Racham B'Chanan. We say when we sense that it's not just an encounter, but it's an ongoing relationship. So only then is it really the type of slichas that is for Rosh Hashanah and Yom HaKippurim. So it's only after the 6 weeks, only after the 6 weeks, and sometimes the 7th week, that has to be a standard, that the Jew can say Hashem Rel Kel Racham V'Chanim the way it's necessary before Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah is not just an encounter with God, it's recognizing the relationship with God. And as far as the Shita of the Rambam is concerned, the Rambam felt, yes, the Kol Shofar is a sound the sound of the shofar is HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kol Shofar Hafata, God making his presence known to the Jewish people on a permanent basis. When we blow the shofar, it's the perpetuation of the experience of Sinai. But in order to do that, it has to be a blowing of shofar that has halachic status. And the only shofar that has halachic status is the shofar of Rosh Hashanah. So because of that, the Shem Hashem Kel Rachum B'Chanan, the Slichas, are reserved for the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, according to the Rambam. That's how we could understand the Shita of the Rambam. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Did you say earlier that towards the beginning, the Beis Halevi fasted on Erev Rosh Hashanah or on Rosh Hashanah?
On Rosh Hashanah.
This is a little bit off topic, but if we are trying to awaken from our lethargy for the presence of Hashem, why did all Nevi'im besides Moshe prophesize while they were asleep?
Why? Because, in other words, but in order to give over their message, they had to wake up.
What did you say about the sheet of the Rashba?
No, the Rashba is talking why we don't make a bracha on Sfira Sa'omer of Shechianu. So he lists, he says we only say, the Balamor really suggests something along those lines also in one teretz. He says we only make a bracha of Shechianu on a mitzvah that's associated with simcha, with joy. And then when he gets to the mitzvah of shofar, we make Shechianu and shofar, he says there's joy associated with shofar because of the knowledge that as a result of the shofar, we are going to receive kapara from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We feel assured that we're going to get kapara from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And my sense is that has to do with the sensing of the presence of God. Because why do we have doubts? Because we feel estranged from God, separated from God. And the Kol HaShofar comes and says, no, we can perpetuate that experience of Sinai, of sensing the presence of God.
Okay, there aren't any questions here, so thank you very much.